sat down like this for a few minutes with Tom McIntyre.
I did.
When he was retiring.
I did.
And you were on the other side asking him all about his career and longevity and experiences. And now here you are.
Here I am.
Garry Moore.
Who's that guy? This TV guy. Wow. Yeah, it's a little different being on this side of the camera.
Take us back, way back. This is a long time for you.
It is. It is.
Not just in this business, but take me back to that kid on Chicago's South Side.
Wow, the kid on Chicago's South Side had these ideas when he would turn on the TV and see different stories. And I used to think there are some stories that weren't being told. There were things that were happening in my neighborhood and in my community that weren't being told. You know, I was a child of the 60s, so I was 10 years old when Dr. King was killed, and came of age in the 70s in high school and that type of thing. And so my brothers, you know, flirted with the Black Panthers, and my father and mother were old enough to be my grandparents. And so when they talked about their grandparents, they were going back into, you know, slavery era and into the South. And so I always had this idea that when I would turn on the TV, you know, I didn't see stuff that was relevant to me. And so I had an interest in writing. When I was in English, one of my English teachers encouraged me to write, and I started keeping a journal. And so that was always a passion of mine. When I went into college, though, at Bradley, I was actually majoring in engineering, and quickly found out that that wasn't for me, and then fell back on writing and met a wonderful gentleman by the name of George Armstrong, who was the head of the speech team, who really encouraged me to pursue my passion in terms of expression, cultural arts, speaking, and expressing oneself, you know, as far as that kid on Chicago's South Side had a yearning to tell stories that weren't being told.
And that's what you've done then for much of your career, even in your radio days. And I think this is so interesting. You started out, among your many jobs, working in a country station at a time, though, when there had to be some kind of public affairs programming, too. There was news on that country music radio station. Tell me more about that.
Back in the 70s, 60s, or whatever, all radio stations were required to have 15% of their programming as news and public affairs. And yeah, I was working for a country western radio station. George Armstrong called me and said, hey, they have a minority internship program at WXCL. And one of my mentors in radio, Bill Marlowe, God rest his soul, taught me everything about radio. And I had a show called Black Perspective. Even though this was a country western radio station, they had shows called Status of Women, State of the Arts, The Senior Report. And so there was this commitment to news and public affairs. We won awards, Associated Press awards. Radio was the go-to for a lot of people for their news. We used to laugh at the TV stations because we would scoop them on stories. And when President Reagan came into office in the 80s, they deregulated stations from that requirement. But I cut my teeth on news and public affairs in radio and learned a lot about interviewing people, different sides of the story. There was a thing called the fairness doctrine where you couldn't just get one side, you had to get the other side. And so all those old school principles of journalism in terms of gathering stories and giving people different perspectives. You learn a lot when you're 20, 21 years old and you have to sit down for a half an hour with different newsmakers every week. So that was my introduction to radio. I did learn a little bit about country music, though, while I was there.
Really?
You know,
what was the most interesting thing you learned?
The titles of the songs, you know, like Drop Kick Me Jesus, Through the Goalposts of Life. You know, that was one of my favorites. And
Really?
you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille. You know,
I'm more familiar with that one.
yeah, 4 hungry children and a crop in the field. So, yeah, Charlie Pride.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Okay, so from radio, how did you transition to television?
I quit radio because of deregulation, really. After deregulation, radio stations cut their news departments because they were no longer required to have news and public affairs. And so they cut their commitment across the board. A lot of people consider deregulation as the death of radio news, or the beginning of the death of radio news. And so I quit that job. I was unemployed for a month or two until I got a phone call from one of my classmates who was on the speech team with me, Dennis Upa, who by that time was working at WEEK, and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm getting ready to go back to Chicago." And by this time I had been news director at WXEL for a couple of years. And he said, "Hey, there's a job opening here at Channel 25, and you should come and audition for it." So I did. And that was 1985.
1985. You started out as a reporter and then weekend anchor, and quickly moved from there to this new program called 25 News Today.
Yeah.
Or back in the day, I guess it would have been News 25 Today.
Yeah,
Early morning, any way you cut it.
right.
What were those first newscasts like?
Those first newscasts were interesting, but backing up, when I was on weekends, I almost didn't make it as an anchor because I didn't know what I was supposed to do when I was on camera. So people appreciated the fact that I had this knowledge, and I'd go out and I'd do these great stories, and I had, you know, the voice people liked and all this other kind of stuff. And so I thought this would be easy. But what I didn't know was where to look when I was on camera. So I would be anchoring with my co-anchor, and when she would be reading her stories, I would be fidgeting and, doing different stuff, but I didn't know that I was on camera.
You weren't paying attention to her, what she had to say. Anything.
Right, and so after a couple of newscasts like that, they started to think, okay, well, he doesn't know what he's doing, or
What's up with that guy?
he's weird, like he's on camera.
The way I talk about you all the time.
He's doing all this weird stuff. Well, I didn't know that I was on camera. And my co-anchor didn't bother to tell me that, hey, while you're on camera, you should be like looking, professional or whatnot. And so it took me to turn on the TV and roll a tape, back then it was videotape, and watch me, and then I thought, oh, God, what am I doing? How stupid is that? And so I straightened up, and I saved my job because they were seriously going to nix me because they didn't know that I was.
That was going to be that. Well, and you know what? One of those early stories I remember, and let me back up for just a moment. I'm one of those people who could say, I grew up watching you, Garry Moore.
Oh, wow.
I was in junior high when you started here at this news station.
Wow.
And growing up in Peoria, of course, I was watching 25 and got to know Garry Moore like any other viewer would. And I remember you interviewing Richard Pryor when he was shooting part of his movie
JoJo Dancer,
in his hometown.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was interesting. Pryor was, as you know, going through a period in his life where he was being very introspective and reflecting on his life. If you watch that movie, you'll see him as a grown man watching the little boy, Richard Pryor. So he was really trying to figure out how he evolved as a person. And he had these demons that he was, trying to reconcile with his fame and all of that. And so when you got to talk to him, I remember his personal agent saying, just be careful, just take it easy, just, don't, be overbearing and, this kind of thing. And so all of us, when we got ready to interview him, were kind of, nervous because we didn't know what he would be like. But then as soon as you start talking to him, he just opened up and talked about his friends who he grew up with and was pretty open. So yeah, that I remember that.
All right, so reflect on some other important stories that you've covered over the years? You've been well-traveled. You've taken your storytelling beyond our borders to bring the news back to Central Illinois residents, stories that, as you mentioned, maybe wouldn't otherwise have been told. I'm thinking Cuba.
Right.
Haiti.
Yeah, Cuba, Haiti, South Africa, Dominican Republic, Million Man March. But backing up to one of the first stories I did that was a local story, it was on welfare. And I remember the producer, after I did the story, asking me to borrow my tape so he could cut a tease, you know, coming up at 6, we'll have this story on welfare and Garry Moore, blah, blah, blah. And so he went and he got the tape and then he came back and he said, yeah, so you did a story on welfare, right? I said, yeah, and it's in there, okay. And then he came back later and said, and so you queued it up to the welfare recipient, right? And I said, yeah, yeah, and then he came back. And then later he admitted he was thrown because I had interviewed a white male. And in his mind, he was thinking that I was gonna be talking to a black woman. And so that was kind of the introduction to the newsroom, that, you know, someone with a different perspective was in the newsroom who was going to go against the grain of convention. And so, yeah, in South Africa, at the time, Caterpillar had not divested as a lot of corporations had. And I went to South Africa with a church group.
This was at the time of apartheid.
This was at a time of apartheid. And I did the story on the church group's mission, but then also made some contacts with a Caterpillar facility there and talked to a representative about why they didn't divest. And of course they said they thought they were being good corporate citizens and following the Sullivan principles and all of this. And yeah, that story, Pretoria to Peoria, I think is what we called it. I did go to Cuba with Governor Ryan before he was arrested, okay? And he took a delegation of business owners and other people there, a Republican governor who was encouraging the United States to end its embargo against Cuba and open up trade. So it was a different perspective. And I'll never forget when Fidel Castro came into the University of Havana, my camera died, you know, right as he came in.
Of course.
You know, my camera died.
Murphy's Law.
And I had to run out to the van and get a battery. And when I came back in, the door was locked and these big 6'6" Cuban security guards were there, and I didn't speak Spanish. And I'm trying to tell them I'm a journalist, I'm here to shoot Castro, right?
But careful with your words.
And then I hear this lady saying, Garry Moore, across the street. And it was a professor at ISU, a sociology professor, who just happened to be there. And she was from Puerto Rico. She spoke fluent Spanish, Dr. Mara Toromorn. And she explained to them why I was there, and I came back and, you know, was able to do that. And so, you know, all those trips were just interesting. Haiti was, you know, such a profound trip for me because, as you know, I'm a playwright, and from Haiti I was able to get some just
interesting material.
Yeah,
historic
material to, you know, give me fodder to write The Ghosts of Haiti. But the other thing I want to say about Haiti is that when I was editing that piece, one of my coworkers came into the edit booth and they were watching this piece. But before, they came in and they were just sharing with me their problems of the day. You know, like, hey, how you doing? Oh, you know, my kids are doing this, and, you know, my VCR didn't work, and my, you know, blah, 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 and this kind of thing. And then as they were talking, I'm editing this piece on Haiti, and then they stopped and they looked at it, and they were quiet. And then I said, what's wrong? And then they said, nothing. You know, my problems are not nearly as bad as what they have going on. So, yeah.
You knew you were touching someone's heart in a powerful way there in that moment, as I'm sure you eventually did then through your story for so many viewers.
Yeah. Hopefully. I don't, you know, I think you and I, we talk about this all the time, you know, what we're doing is resonating with people, and we hope that it is.
It is. Don't you have to believe that if you do this job for 33 years, that somehow, some way, your storytelling, your truth-telling is making an impact, even if it's only on a few individuals at a time, that has some kind of ripple effect, like throwing a stone across the water.
Yeah. I mean, you hope so. You hope so. And you're hoping you're having a positive impact on the community. You know, there's a lot of negativity in the world. And it's very easy for us to become cynical and jaded as we approach this job, because we've seen the negative side of people and the underbelly and corruption and theft and, you know.
Hardest story ever for you to cover?
Hardest story. Man, I think there was a lady who was killed by ex-boyfriend or husband, significant other, an act of domestic violence, and that was witnessed by a child. That when police came into the house, they saw the woman's body, and the kid was there. You know.
How do you communicate that? How do you?
So I mean,
How do you not become jaded, and to be able to share that with viewers, that kind of moment, that not only was a woman's life lost, a mother, but a child being witness to that,
yeah.
and that kind of domestic violence is a reality for many more young children than we probably can realize.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, there's a certain aspect of what we do where we just kind of tune ourselves out and just report it, and you try not to think about it, but then afterwards, you know, you can't help but think about it. And I mean, you know, it's, you know, it obviously is something I haven't forgotten.
Obviously. One of the ways, though, that you continue to make an impact beyond your storytelling on air, and something that I'm sure you will continue to do, is what you do out there in the community. You mentioned as a playwright, you're a fantastic musician and drummer, a storyteller in spoken word, and you've brought that gift to school children and others around the area. How important has that been a part of your life?
Yeah, that's, wow, you know, that is a blessing that I've been able to share with so many people. People come up to me. I remember I was someplace and a little boy came up and said, "Hey, you came to my school," and his father was with him and said, "Yeah, and you came to my school." You know, and then I felt really old.
You've been around.
But the educators in town have given me a second career, really. It started out with me doing storytelling for Black History Month and augmenting, I guess, whatever social studies or history curriculum that teachers would have. And from that, it just kind of grew into me doing substitute teaching and then doing plays that brought history to life, and, you know, most recently with Black to the Future, which was based on Dr. Garrett's book, The Negro in Peoria, which really talks about Peoria African-American history, which is significant because there's a lot of stuff that Peoria offered the nation in terms of American history that is underreported. And so I think it's important work, and yeah, I plan to continue that. And I'm glad people appreciate it. You know, you mentioned me as being a fantastic drummer. In drumming circles, I'm not that fantastic.
Better than most of us would ever.
But no, I mean, that is, cultural arts, I think, is important. And I remember interviewing Dr. Garrett before he died, and I asked him, I said, should we do Black History Month, or should we do Black History sprinkled throughout just the general curriculum? And without hesitation, he said both. You know, that American ideals of freedom, justice, and equality are best measured when they relate to how America treated its citizens of color. And so to that extent, you know, Black history is kind of this needle and thread that really sews the American fabric together, and you can see the tears in it also.
In your storytelling, well, the stories you grew up knowing in your home, and the stories then that you've been able to share with school children around our community throughout Central Illinois, these stories will become better known because of people like you. Think about that for your grandchildren, your two grandsons. They will not just know these stories from hearing Granddad talk about it, but your work, and hopefully then the work of others, will make it something that is just part of the community.
Hopefully, hopefully. Who knows? Who knows? There's a gentleman named Uziki Nelson who's a sculptor, and you'll see some of his work nationally when you go to Washington, D.C. He's got these big old iron Picasso, you know, towering things. There's one right next to Valeska Hinton School as you turn down MacArthur. He did it in honor of his father, who was one of Peoria's first Black dentists. And he told me something. He said, you know, when you have a platform, when you have an opportunity, use it and kick as hard as you can, because you never know when you're going to get that opportunity again. And so that's as much as you can do. But the other thing that he and I used to talk about is whether or not people receive it is that's not up to you. You know, all you can do is just put it out there. And if they embrace it, then that's great. But if they don't, then they don't. And don't feel bad about it. Just make sure that you do what you're supposed to do.
Well, then I suppose you're teaching Kanye and now Kendrick the opportunity and the responsibility they have to tell their stories, their community's stories, to use their platforms, whatever those are.
Yeah, for good. You know, use your platform for good, if at all possible.
Well, you've done a lot of good in many ways. I want you to talk a little bit more about the good of this newscast of 25 News Today. Way back in the day, you started this as a half-hour program.
We did.
With Kathy Wyman, right?
Yes. So Kathy Wyman and I, well, first we used to do the cut-ins, these little 5-minute inserts in the Today Show. And then somebody said, hey, we're going to do a morning show. And Gary, you can get to produce it, and it'll be from 6:30 to 7 o'clock. And it was great. It was fun. We used to do it on the interview set. We used to, you know, joke and you know, Phil Supple, our news director at the time, used to refer to it as a news salad. So that you had a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Toss a little bit of everything in there.
And so that's how we did it. And then we used to, every Friday, take the show on the road. And people may remember we would be live at the Morton Pumpkin Festival, or live at the opening of the Chiefs game, or live every Friday. We would try and be live somewhere on location. And then they said, you know, the show is doing so great, we're going to expand it to an hour. And they was like, oh, yeah, great. And it would go from 6 to 7. And they never went forward like 7:30, like
No,
into the morning.
no,
They just kept moving
back into the
backwards.
night, yeah.
And then it was 5:30 to 7.
And meanwhile, you're getting new co-anchors along the way.
Yes, indeed. So we had Denise Heilman, or there was Kelly Morgan in there, and Denise Heilman. I'm not going to remember everybody. Laura Skirty.
Yours truly,
Sandy Gallant. Yeah.
And then
yes.
Maddie, and then I came back. And
Right.
yeah,
right.
you've had a number of co-anchors over the years. You have been the mainstay as this show evolved from a half an hour to two and a half hours.
Yeah. And when I moved to Bloomington, that was probably the most difficult, when it was 5:30 to 7, and I was living in Bloomington. And then at that point I said, okay, we need a producer. And so the station was smart enough to hire a producer for the show. And we could no longer take our show on the road because it was too much of a big,
To bring 2.5 hours, just
thing to bring. And so, but yeah, it was fun. And all of the co-anchors who I've worked with were very talented young ladies who were smart and who brought their own storytelling and panache to the program.
Mm-hmm. How have you been able to do this job, particularly this shift, for 30 plus years? We joke about getting up in the middle of the night, and people will say, oh, I watch you every morning, or they'll say, oh, I watch you every morning at 6:30. Well, by then we've already been on the air for 2 hours. And people are like, what? People are genuinely surprised and amazed at the ability to do this for so many years. I am amazed that you have done this for so many years. How?
One, I think, is a good diet. I think you have to eat smart and drink a lot of water. And I think the other thing is taking naps. You know, the sleep experts say you should have one contiguous sleep, and that's the best thing for you. I just can't do that. I also don't drink coffee. I don't do hardly any caffeine.
Strangely, yeah, you've got your cup of tea there. And
yeah, but I think, you know, diet and naps have been really the saving grace for me, because I've done stuff in the evening. You know, I'll be at stuff at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and go to sleep, and then turn around and get up at 3, and so that's only 5 hours of sleep, or 4 hours, or whatever.
It had to have gotten harder over the years.
It has. It has. You know, somebody made one of the previous news directors, I remember making it late to the broadcast. I didn't make it on time. And he looked and he said, you know, so in the last 20 years, you've only been late 2 times. He said, that's not bad, you know. And so, yeah, but just in the last year, it's like, wait a minute, you know, those numbers are increasing, so maybe it's time for me to stop. But the joke,
take that as a cue, but really,
the joke was that every day we worked the shift took a year off of your life, okay? So, you know, if you do that math, then I'm a vampire.
Yeah, really. You're not really here. Talk a little bit to me, if you would, about your family.
My family, if I can start with my parents, who were old enough to be my grandparents. You know, my father passed away when I was working here. He never really got a chance to see me bloom in my career. And after he passed away, my mom was in Chicago, and I kidnapped her and brought her to Peoria and bought her house, and she lived on the East Bluff for the last 20 years of her life. She lived until she was 94. So she got a chance to see me. And my mom and my father, as I said earlier, were old enough to be my grandparents. And so they really gave me an old school kind of upbringing. And so from a value standpoint, whatever good things people may see in me in terms of character or generosity or caring, it comes from them, you know, especially from my mom. you know, everybody knows that my wife is on the city council, and that her work, you know, that's her own community involvement. You know, we were business owners, and that taught us a lot about your civic responsibility and what it means to contribute to a community. Our business was, for a long period of time, a mainstay in Uptown Normal, and it was a cultural arts store. So, and we were, I want to say, the largest African American gift store in downstate Illinois. And, you know, being business owners teaches you about the economy and the community and what the community needs and that type of thing. And I think that really has sparked her wanting to do more, not just with the city council, but her involvement with the Minority Business Development Center and the Black Business Alliance.
Helping other small business owners.
Helping other small business owners, exactly. So, yeah.
More though on family, because you say that you're not only were your parents old enough to be your grandparents, that means that you had several older siblings. You were the youngest of what, 8 kids?
Yeah, yeah. So my older brothers
helped parent you too in some ways.
They
I bet.
did. They did indeed. They did. They were the ones who really gave me my political and social education. Because keep in mind, you know, these guys were growing up in the 60s and 70s in Chicago on the South Side. We lived on 45th Street. The Disciple Street Gang was on 43rd, and the Blackstone Rangers were on 47th, you know. And so they were right smack dab in the middle of that. During a time then when a lot of the street gangs were turning away from gangs and turning to the Black Panthers, which was more of a political organization that sought to galvanize these young, restless men and turn them into this militant force. Okay, but that's a lot of social and cultural and political education for, you know, a 10, 12, 14,
Yeah.
16-year-old to receive. And so I got baptized in that with my head held under the water for a long period of time.
And yet, you're very close to your family. You remember your mother and your dad, but your mother with great love. You've talked about her to me many times. You've helped in many ways raise other kids within your family and nurture them and support them. And now, as a father and grandfather, here you are on the verge of at least, let's say, semi-retirement, with an opportunity to spend even more time with them. How does that feel?
It feels good. It really does feel good. You know, with my grandson Kanye and with the littlest one now. Again, going back to something we were talking about before, you don't know how people are going to receive what you give. You know, all you can do is impart and share what you know. And then the hope is that they decode it properly, that there's enough positivity in what you're imparting that they can digest it and use it, and that it'll help them grow up straight and strong. You know, you were right. I've had other young people who we've helped raise, you know, my nieces and nephews and others. And, you know, sometimes it's hit and miss, you know, in terms of you know, what you give and what they eventually do. But all you can do is do your best, you know. And then the other thing, let me just say this, you know, no one is perfect. And so I still have some growing up to do, you know. I mean, I still find myself looking for answers. And, you know, when you go to South Africa and Haiti and other places in the world that are vastly different from what we have here in terms of amenities and standard of living and that type of thing. You know, you have questions about where we fit in and who we are supposed to be as people. And, you know, are we just supposed to, you know, make a certain amount of money and have all these different gadgets and things? You know, is that our purpose in life? You know, I don't think so.
See, I think you're always going to be a reporter and a storyteller because you are naturally curious. You're not satisfied with what is here and now. You're always looking for answers and asking questions. And so I would ask you this question: what's next?
Specifically radio. I'm going back to radio. We've come full circle. I started out in radio, did a little TV thing, and then I'm going back to radio. And this is not a big station. This is a little low-power community station. But like the other station, big commitment to public affairs and information and putting the information out there. Again, if people want to tune in and they know at certain times we've got this information that's going to be coming out, that's cool. You know, but that, you know, we can't really control what, you know, people's tastes and stuff like that, you know. So I think, so radio, I'll be teaching somewhere, whether it's at the community college or subbing in some of the schools, teaching either English or history or communications. Mm-hmm. And then I'll be doing some theatrical stuff, you know, storytelling and drumming and sleeping. Sleeping.
You've got a lot of that to catch up on.
I do. I really do. So.
Well, I would not have come back and woken up early for anyone else.
Hey, I'm glad to hear that.
Except to know that I was going to sit with you, my mentor. You know, I interned on this newscast with you.
I know.
And it's been a privilege to work with such a genuine soul, someone who cares as passionately as you do, and is not satisfied with just coming in here, putting in his day's work and going home, but always wants to help the people around him excel and do better. And we are all better, this community is better for having you as our storyteller.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And thanks for being my friend.
Thank you.